Okay, we're live now.
We're live now. Okay, great.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in. My name is Maurice Casey. I am a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast. I'm also the associate historian at EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum. So it's great to start this set of events that EPIC is hosting as part of the Outing the Past LGBTQ plus History Festival in Dublin with a number of other partner museums. Our first event of today will be a conversation between myself and two founding members of the Irish Lesbian and Gay Organisation in New York, Anne Mcguire and Paul O'Dwyer. And before I begin our conversation, just to note to everyone watching in, if you'd like to ask a question, please just place it in the YouTube comments below, and then James, my colleague, will send that to me, and then I can pose it to Anne and Paul. So with that, welcome to Anne and Paul. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're both keeping well. Anne's joining us from New York and Paul from Ireland. So I guess, guys, to begin, if you just quickly introduce yourselves and say hello to everyone. And we can start with you.
Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Anne Mcguire. I was involved with the Irish Lesbian and Gay Organisation from the beginning for about 10 or 11 years. And I hope we can give you a good roundup of what it was all about and what we did. And it's good to see you, Paul and Maurice.
And I'm Paul O'Dwyer. Good to see you, Anne and Maurice, and thank you, everybody else, for joining. Even though I'm in Ireland at the moment, I live in New York, and I was involved in the Irish Lesbian and Gay Organisation from its inception, probably for 5 or 6 years after that. And yeah, I'm glad to be here and looking forward to this.
Great. So I guess to begin, who wants to tackle the question of introducing the Irish Lesbian Gay Organisation, how it came about, and why it became so well known in the 1990s in the broader activist scene in Ireland and in the US?
Well, so I'll kick off here and then let Anne kick in, or pick up the. But so Anne and I had known each other from Ireland, and we had both moved to the US on or about the same time, and we were friends. And and maybe you remember the dates of this better than me, but at some point there was a meeting organized of people who wanted to found a organization or a group of Irish gays and lesbians who were living in New York. And we had our first meeting at a Japanese restaurant in Chelsea, actually. And after that, we began to, have more meetings, and kind of gradually a structure and an organization evolved from there, and different people were involved. Like there's Irish people, there's Irish Americans, and people who identified as Irish or were just interested in it in any way. And then at a certain point, we decided to apply to march in the St. Patrick's Day Parade, and then of course things took off from there. And maybe you have more specific dates than I do, I think, about that.
Well, it's not, yeah, I mean, I think basically there was an ad put into one of the local New York Irish newspapers. It was a pretty new one called The Irish Voice. And a lot of us saw this ad, basically it was saying their, friends who figured out they were gay and wondered if there were other Irish gay people in the city who wanted to meet. So that's how it started. I mean, I guess if you have more specific questions, Maurice, because everything happened very quickly. We marched, we formed in April, had our very first meeting. That June, after only a few meetings, because it was only once a month, we marched in the New York City gay pride parade. And really, in many ways, it was out of that experience we thought, let's go for the St. Patrick's Day parade, because a lot of people were really, really surprised to see a group identifying as being Irish and queer in the gay pride parade. And that kind of set the cogs going and saying, okay, gay community doesn't know about us. I bet the Irish community doesn't have a clue either.
And Paul, you mentioned you marched in the St. Patrick's Day parade and then it all took off. And I think with that phrase that it all took off, there's a loss that we can kind of disentangle from that. I mean, this experience of marching amongst other queer people and then being surprised by this nature of Irish identity, what then, I guess for people who may not be familiar with the story, was then the reaction of the parade then in New York on St. Patrick's Day, and let's say the Irish American community's response?
You mean on the day of the actual St. Patrick's Day parade itself, or
yes,
as a response to our application?
That when we're thinking of this history as well, would it be fair to say that the organization initially emerged as a social group, or was there always a kind of a campaign, an activist, agenda within the group from the outset, or was it really with the response on St. Patrick's Day that made the group look about campaigning around this idea about Irishness and Irish America and facing off against that and trying to make it more inclusive?
Well, I think that the group, and actually one of the conversations we had within the group that I remember was this kind of debate, like, are we a social organization? Are we a political organization? Are we, and it was, I think the fact that we were having that debate, said fairly clearly that it was different things to different people. So there were people who joined who had an, kind of a history in activism and in, social justice movements and stuff like that. And then there were people who just wanted to meet other Irish gay people, and people who wanted to make friends, and people who were just curious about what it was all about. And so we did, to my recollection, and maybe Anne knows differently, but we didn't ever reach a point at saying we are this type of organization, or this is our focus, or this is our agenda. We had, it was different things to different people. And then when we, we kind of became very visible, not only as a result of marching in the parade, but became very visible as a result of our application to march in the parade, and which we submitted an application to the parade organizers, and they said no, and we filed a complaint with the Human Rights Commission, and then the media got a hold of the story, and it suddenly became front page headlines, and that was well before the parade, and that was really what kind of made us very, very visible, and got everybody on different sides of the issue involved and aware of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, one thing I would add is I think the group was a very broad stroke about who we were for. We were for everyone, basically, in the city who wanted to join, and for the most part at the beginning it was Irish immigrants, most whom had left Ireland for all kinds of reasons. But to put it in a little context, we formed before decriminalisation in Ireland. That hadn't even happened yet. And it was a very, very different time, both in Ireland and across the United States. So whether or not the group was political or not, are set out with that agenda very much depended on who had joined. And it just so happened that a lot of people were interested and did join who had a history of being politically active or activists, along with everyone else. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways when people like that are in the group, I will include myself in that, tend to be far more focused, tend to know more of what we actually want out of the group, and also can attempt to make the group as inclusive as possible for everyone else. And then as soon as the St. Patrick's Day parade issue happened and we were not welcomed and we were treated very badly when we marched with David Dinkins, the mayor, who described his marching with ILGO to marching in Selma, Alabama during the civil rights movement. So that's how bad it was, and that will give people some kind of context to what the experience was like. And deciding that we were actually going to fight the organizers of the parade was a political decision, and the whole group made that, including people who are not out of the closet, who had never been activists before. The group did decide to take that on and deal with the consequences, both here and back home in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised by the level of vitriol and hatred that was shown in the parade, or did you have a sense that there was something latent within Irish America and the community that was kind of waiting to come out, or was evident in any case elsewhere?
Well, so my thoughts about that were, so first of all, when we started to, when we filed our application to join and we had meetings with the organizers of the St. Patrick's Day Parade, or with some of them, for me at least, it was like stepping into a time warp. So these were people, predominantly Irish, like older Irish immigrants to the US, who had been, organizing the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York for years, but who were rooted in some sort of, time warp from Ireland in the 1940s, and who were, shocked by the idea. Well, they were horrified by the idea of, gay men. They were, lesbians. I'm not sure that they even, knew up to that point that lesbians existed. They were just, it was an environment and just kind of like a whole, it was just a whole environment that I was shocked to discover existed. I had never in my life, growing up in Ireland, I'd never come across people or situations who were as regressive and repressive and living, very ironically, who had, they had come to Ireland and they lived here in, the New York metropolitan area, but nonetheless who lived in this complete bubble of, what they perceived as like past historical Ireland. And so that kind of maybe should have set us up for what happened on the day of the parade, but it didn't. And I don't think anything could really have set you up for that level of just complete hatred that was exhibited by people. And this is something that we, I mentioned earlier in our discussions about what we wanted to talk about today. So I recently watched a movie about a gay pride parade that took place in a city in the Balkan countries in the early, I think in 2001, and where the parade goers were attacked by far-right nationalists, and it showed this footage of that and all that happening. And I was wondering, well, that's kind of what happened to us. And so it was, I think it took many years to kind of process it, that this, community of people who came out to watch the St. Patrick's Day Parade were actually the equivalent of these, very, very far right, hate-filled groups. Though, of course, they would never think that of themselves, and most people would probably never call them that. But, they had really racist slurs to yell at David Dinkins. They had really, really homophobic slurs to yell at us. There was threats, there was things thrown. It was, and so nothing could have prepared us for that. And I think just to finish up on that again, having, I mean, I grew up in Ireland in the 70s and 80s, and this was nothing I had ever, not just not been exposed to, but never thought that in a million years that you could possibly be exposed to, in Ireland, much less walking down Fifth Avenue in New York.
Mm-hmm. And in, I guess, considering kind of the opposite of that, did you find any surprising allies? Was there support from quarters or generations that you didn't expect to have around and in response to that first march?
I think within the Irish community, an absolute no. I mean, we were completely abandoned by the Irish American community here, completely and utterly. And that is actually what I find most unforgivable of anyone in a position of power here. There were a couple of people. There was Paul's namesake, Paul O'Dwyer, who had actually been Mayor David Dinkins. He had basically taken him under his arm in the Democratic Party in New York City and showed him the ropes. So he was a good guy, but the next generation, his son and people like that, who would have been closer to our generation, the power brokers of Irish America in New York were despicable around this. However, what was very interesting is New Yorkers in general were appalled by what had happened. And in general, I think New Yorkers totally supported us, thought this was completely nuts in many senses. And the other thing I found extremely interesting, because it was pre-decriminalization in Ireland, Irish people in Ireland, I heard from lots of people about their mothers and their grannies and their fathers, were appalled by how their children in America were being treated. So it became that kind of, familial feeling of the Irish in Ireland wanting to protect their children that had emigrated and being appalled by how we were being treated. Mm-hmm. The Irish in New York wanting to have absolutely nothing to do with us, which carried out throughout the entire several of the first years when we needed that voice. They totally abandoned us. To New Yorkers in general, and New York City politicians wouldn't touch the parade with a 10-foot barge pole. So, it was interesting how that shook out. And then, of course, Paul, maybe you can address this, is the support in the gay community and how we were viewed or seen in the gay community in New York.
So within the community, within our community, the LGBT community in New York, we were, people were completely on our side. There were some disagreements between us and the wider community with regard to legal strategies and disagreements about, First Amendment stuff, and, people who organize a parade have the right to limit the parade participants to who they want, and it's a free speech thing and all that kind of stuff. So, which is very annoying, but overall, we had pretty unqualified support from the community when it came to people speaking out on our behalf, and most importantly, when it came to people really just kind of going out on the street and putting their bodies on the line and sitting in traffic, risking arrest, being arrested, going to court, fighting cases in court. All of that was, there was a sense at that point that if we had to choose between which community we belonged to or which community accepted us, it was very, very clear that it was the LGBT community that accepted us and not the Irish community. And while there were individual Irish people here and there who, you know, came out and supported us. Those were, people did that on an individual basis, but there was, as Anne said, there was absolutely no, zero, nada, zilch institutional support for us from the Irish community. And as time went by, when there was voices of support for us, they were qualified voices of support. They were saying, well, we support them, but, you know, we support them, but we don't want them saying bad things about the church. We don't want them insulting police officers. We don't want them blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, so we, our support came from the progressive political movement in the city and the LGBT community, which, of course, which overlapped.
Mm-hmm. And sticking with that theme, I wonder what you felt when you spoke to other activists who were getting involved with your campaign, who weren't Irish, who weren't even Irish American. What was the sense of the general motivation? Why did they feel that this cause mattered to them?
I mean, for as I understood it, I mean, I don't think people, I don't think it was a thing that people had to articulate. Like, oh, this is, you know, I mean, okay, so there's a parade of, there's a, you know, parade of a group of gay Irish people who are being, you know, people are threatening to kill them because they want to walk down, you know, the street in the St. Patrick's Day parade. So I don't think that they had to sit down and kind of think out, you know, like formulate a reason why they wanted to come out and support us. I mean, it was our struggle was their struggle in that sense. And in the same way as, you know, we had been involved in, you know, struggles of, or, you know, the fights for the rights of gay people in other situations and environments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it was a pretty clear situation, and it was highly visible. And that certainly helped us a great deal, that it was such a visible story. Every St. Patrick's Day as it came up, it was central. So, you know, the organizers of the parade were really strategically stupid. They should have just let us in, everything would have been over. Instead, it became, St. Patrick's Day became synonymous with queer liberation. And, you know, that was their doing as much as it was ours. And I think Paul had been quite involved with ACT UP, and several of us were involved in other groups in the city. And while this happened, my partner Marie and myself were involved in founding the Lesbian Avengers. So, you know, we knew a lot of people in the city already, and, you know, needed to talk through a lot of what was going on, and with people who were more familiar with New York. I mean, in some ways, maybe the shock that Paul described about marching in the parade and the response was really very, very shocking to us. We hadn't grown up here. Perhaps had we would have been a little bit more prepared. And in the same vein, you know, I certainly didn't understand completely the absolute power of the Archdiocese under Cardinal O'Connor, the way people who grew up here did, or people who were active across, you know, feminist and gay and other political battles here. So we really needed to bring those people in to understand completely and to be effective, you know. And it was we didn't really have to ask. It was such a huge issue here in the 1990s in the city. It was kind of obvious for activists who wanted to do stuff to be involved.
I also think it was very to, you know, so I think context is important, and New York at that time was a really fertile ground for, you know, for LGBT activism. There was ACT UP, there was the Lesbian Avengers, and then Queer Nation started on around the same time. There was and I think this may have happened afterwards, but after the whole parade thing happened, but it was on around the same time. There was this group called the Pink Panthers, who were they would kind of patrol the streets dressed in like, I don't know, like pink hats and stuff like that, as to protect people from being gay bashed, and as a response to a series of high-profile gay bashings. There was subsequently then there was the Women's Action Coalition started. There was like a lot of activism going on at that time. And so I think the obvious and the natural thing for these groups to do was to kind of stand in solidarity for us. And of course, the natural thing, at least for me anyway, was, I mean, this type of environment was where I didn't really sit down and strategize. I mean, for me, this was kind of like this was like home territory for me, and this was the environment I belong. These were the groups that I belonged to. So it wasn't, for me, I didn't see myself straddling a divide between like the two. And I don't think people in those organizations saw themselves as straddling a divide either. And I also think that most of those organizations were, and people for the most part were respectful of saying, well, this is your battle, and so we're going to stand with you, blah, 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 but we don't want to take it over. So this is your thing. Like, you guys, you're the voice, you speak about it, you set the agenda. We're supporting you, whatever it is that you do.
Yeah, and if they weren't, they got an earful pretty quickly. I mean, we were very clear about, I mean, and we said this over and over, the fact that we were Irish and queer we couldn't take one from the other. So we were definitely in charge of what we wanted, and got the support for it. And it was rare. On rare occasions, people tried to come in and say, this is what you need to do. We're like, yeah, we're fine. Thank you.
And I also, just remind everyone watching in as well, do drop in questions and we can weave them into the conversation throughout. And I also wanted to ask, both of you had experience of related forms of activism and advocacy in Ireland. How did you compare those two experiences? I mean, you spoke there about 90s New York being this real landscape of all these various activist groups. Did Ireland feel similar? Did it feel like, relative to the two populations, there was a similar energy, a similar kind of activist landscape in both Ireland and in New York?
Okay, I'll step in and take this one. I had massive culture shock when I hit New York, and the first group I did go to was ACT UP. And ACT UP had weekly meetings where hundreds of people attended. And my experience of a meeting like that was an annual conference, maybe. So the culture shock was intense. And also, I had not, I thought I was fairly comfortable being a lesbian and being an activist around that, but I realized I had a lot of internalized homophobia, and I wasn't on the same level as the people I was seeing at ACT UP at all. So that was something I needed to take on and think about. But I think when it comes to the nitty-gritty of just organizing and doing stuff, I didn't see a massive difference. When you get into those small little huddles of people that, you're planning, you're organizing, you want to get something done. In those terms, I think it's very similar. Even the same conflicts come up, the same arguments, the same tactics, depending on the time you're in and what's going on where you are. I think that kind of work is very similar. And I felt like, I know a lot of other people in ILGO at the time, I felt like I had come from a hotbed of activism in Ireland when I moved to New York. I felt like there was a lot going on in Ireland at the time. I mean, there had been the anti-amendment campaign. There was the Eileen Flynn case. There was women in prison in Armagh jail, those campaigns. And before all that, there was the hunger strike and the dirty protest. And it felt like a hotbed of activism to me. So when I came here, it was about finding where to go with that. But Paul, you may have had a different experience.
I mean, so I didn't find it, so I think it was different in a sense that people in the US, I think, express themselves differently. So, and particularly, you know, when I got involved in ACT UP, I kind of felt like, well, this, of course, this is a wonderful organization, and it kind of like, you know, kind of speaks very clearly to things that I, you know, want to be involved in and believe in and all that kind of stuff. What I suppose was kind of surprising for me, or it took some getting used to, was the, you know, like the political stuff I've been involved in political activism in Ireland before I went there was probably, you know, people were much more sort of, what's the word? Well, people were very into the nitty gritty, and people were very into the ideologies and stuff like that. And then you got to ACT UP, and people were, you know, they were all really young. They were really, not all, but they were mostly young, very good looking. Summertime didn't wear a whole lot of clothes, very sexy. They were all about pictures and images and graphics and how to convey your message in a different way. And, you know, and so that was very different. And something I wasn't used to, but of course I got used to it and became part of it. And so, but as Anne says, like when you, like the work that you do and the way you do the work, which is you kind of like sitting down and strategizing and organizing and working with small groups of people and reaching decisions in particular ways and how you do that, that was not, you know, was not radically different. And you know, and of course you, as happens, as you realize you get older, that you come across the same types of people where you go with the same types of issues and the same types of ways of being, and you also have your own way of being and doing things. And so that doesn't, I think, you know, you give some of yourself to the people that you're working with, and you take some of them away with you. So in that sense, I think you both grow. But there wasn't some big like, oh my God, this is, I've never seen, you know, there wasn't a sudden like culture shock for me.
It's interesting, yeah. There's so much, there's kind of so many different ways you can kind of tackle the question, because on one level, there's a sort of almost Irish exceptionism that we think we're uniquely prone to splits and arguments and so on. But that's the case in any organization. But equally, there are differences. I don't think I've ever seen someone use the adjective sexy for a group of protesters in Ireland, for example, but seems the case in ACT UP in New York. There's a question for the audience as well, which I will bring in now, from Atlas O'Hare, who asks, I'm really interested in hearing about the attitude towards transgender people at that time, including within ILGO, as even a lot of gay and lesbian organizations back then were unsupportive of trans people.
You know, ILGO was kind of a mishmash of everything, and what happened where there was a little bit of conflict was around bisexual and why we hadn't included bisexual in our group's name. But we did have trans activists in the group, and I would say that, you know, the main group was totally open and totally welcoming. It wasn't, you know, trans liberation was not an issue for us back in the early 1990s. The way it would be now, if we were forming now, we would have a totally different organization. But yeah, I think it didn't come up a huge amount. But, you know, I think we had one of our arrest situations. This is where the Greater New York also comes into play. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson got arrested with us one year, and we were very cognizant of taking care of our people. So in an arrest situation, we would never, for example, you would never let one man get arrested on his own. Somebody else would always step in. Or a minor, because we did have minors who showed up, and because they get separated out in jail. So the same would have been for trans people, people of color, which there are Irish, you know, people of Irish heritage that are also people of color. So we were very, very aware and on top of all that stuff. So we always made sure to take care of people around those issues. But I'll go, no doubt, if it was organised in the last 5 or 10 years, would be different and would have a different name. But we were coming from a place of mostly Irish immigrants in the early 1990s in New York. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, I think we did have, I mean, there were trans members of ILGO. I think that I definitely wouldn't say that we were exclusionary. I think that trans visibility was not a priority for us at the time, which I would say was true for pretty much almost all LGBT organizations at the time, is that organizations were not trans exclusionary, but they were like trans visibility was not on their agenda in the way that it rightfully has become since then.
Yeah.
And if there's any more audience questions as well, please do get them in. I'm interested as well in looking kind of beyond New York as well. And I know we've spoken before about the experience in Boston, but I guess to give the audience a sense of what you learned and what you experienced as well in other cities in the US, particularly around Irish queer identity and different groups trying to form around that and what they faced as well.
So there was an Irish gay and lesbian group in Boston who went through roughly the same type of experiences we did by applying to march in the St. Patrick's Day Parade and being refused, and then being ordered into it by a judge, which we weren't ordered into it by a judge, but we were kind of facilitated that one year that we marched. And the physical response from people on the street in Boston was, even worse, like far worse than it had been in New York. It was physically terrifying. And there was an Irish lesbian and gay group that started in San Francisco. But it was not, I wasn't really, I think at the start we were all sort of in touch with one another, but then as time went by, we stopped being in contact. And so I'm not sure what their experiences were. I don't think any of them mirrored what we went through in New York or in Boston. But I do want to, it would be remiss of me if I didn't point out that, so for people who are watching, so New York City has 5 boroughs, with Manhattan, Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. And Staten Island is traditionally been the most conservative of all the boroughs, and LGBT groups still cannot march in the St. Patrick's Day Parade on Staten Island. I actually saw video footage of it like about 2 weeks ago, where the organizers refused to even accept a hand-delivered application from the LGBT group to march in their parade, and it was kind of horrifying to see that signs of this is still happening.
That is shocking.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose we've got about 5 minutes left, everyone. So if you do have another question, do get it in. I suppose I want to ask kind of on a question that might bring us toward the conclusion. I guess it's quite a broad question, but a lot of, this history, when it's recorded or when it's written, a lot of it's being read by a younger generation of activists who are interested in terms of finding a lineage, but also, I guess, in trying to imbibe some idea of a lesson. What was a kind of a lesson in activism that you both took from your work with Algo, and perhaps something that you'd impart if a young activist asked you, what tips do you have from this history or advice?
And you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, I think in many ways you need to trust your own gut. We had several big issues that, I do remember even huddling with Paul once. The group had made a huge decision and we were getting outside pressure, and we just had to go into a room on our own and remember why the group had made the decision it had made. So in many ways, I would say, go with your gut, work with everyone who understands what you want to do regardless. Bring everyone in, have some fun. You have to have a sense of humor around this stuff. You're not always going to agree. I mean, I think this isn't just from this experience. But I think this was one of those flukes. It happened at a time, it happened at a moment, someone put it on the front page of a newspaper. And I think if you find yourself in that situation, go for it, because you can make a difference. I think it was kind of like this was given to us on a plate. We made the decision that we were ready. We were not going back into the closet. Go for it. If you get a gift like that as an activist, take it.
That's great. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say I want to echo some of what Anne said. So I think the most important thing is two most important things are: number one, go with your gut. You have to trust yourself. I mean, don't be naive. Listen to other people. Listen to what they have to say. Listen to people who are older and wiser. But at the end of the day, you have to kind of follow your own gut instincts and do what it is that you think is the right thing to do after thinking things through. And also, you have to have fun, however it is you define that. And there, of course, a lot of what you do in the process of having fun is not fun, but you ultimately have to, if you find yourself forcing yourself into a movement or an organization or stuff like that, and you hate it and you don't like it, then no matter how much you believe in the ultimate goal, if it's not pleasant, if it's not your way of doing things, if it's not your thing, then don't do it. And the second thing is that there's many ways of being an activist. There's many ways of, of fighting for your cause, of pursuing it. And you should do it in the way that works best for you. Not everybody's form of activism works for everybody else. So you have to find your level, and you have to stick with it. And then you have to make people work with you at the level that you're comfortable at, rather than going to somebody else's. But the most important thing is that you have to believe in what it is that you're doing, and find the level at which you can do it best. And then I think my final thing also would be to say, like, don't be naive. And I think in ways we were kind of naive in not realizing what was out there and what was facing us. And so I think that it's important to, to kind of be realistic about what it is that you're facing up against, and what you can hope to achieve from it.
Yeah, I think that's a hard one, Paul. I mean, we were naive because we were in our 20s, and I think don't be afraid of that. I wouldn't agree with
no.
that. I would say do not be afraid of that. Just go for it. You're going to learn. Learning the ropes is another really good thing. I feel like I learned the ropes in Ireland. I learned from all these women and men who had gone ahead of me from all kinds of groups, learned how to be an activist. Learning the ropes is really good. Really good thing if you want to really take on something yourself.
Well, thank you both. I think that's a kind of a natural point to finish up. I'm sure everyone in the audience has learned some ropes in this discussion. So just to let everyone know, we're going to take a break now until 3 when we have our next talk, which will be Vicky Iglakowski-Broad, giving a talk on a hidden archive of letters, love letters between men at the National Archives. So last thing is just to thank Anne and Paul very much for your contributions. It was really great to see you both, and I hope to see you both again. So thanks, guys. So feel free to
Likewise.
just log off as normal.
Okay,
Bye, guys.
thanks.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
And I will just go off as well until 3. Hi everyone. Just to let you know, our next speaker is just having some tech issues, but we should be with you in a minute. Thanks. James, could you let Vicky in the waiting room, please?
Sorry about that.
No problem. I think that was a issue on our end. So thanks, Vicky. Can you see and hear us okay?
I can, and you can hear me okay?
Yes, and see you all good. Cool.
Brilliant.
So we are live, just to let you know. So don't read out your card details or defame a Russian oligarch. I don't think so. But so welcome back everyone to our second session of Out in the Past at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum. And we are joined by Vicky Iglikowski-Broad, who is your position, Vicky, is Principal Records Specialist, is that right? At the
Yeah, Principal Record Specialist in kind of specialising in diverse histories.
Great. At the National Archives in Kew. So thanks very much for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to your talk, which will be on a hidden archive of letters, love letters between men at the National Archives. So Vicky, do you need to share screen?
Yes, I will just attempt to do that now.
So to our invisible tech gremlin James to make sure that that's enabled.
Cool. Sorry, I was just hoping that my PowerPoint would come up there somewhere. Let me try that again. Can you see the presentation slides?
I can. Yep, that looks great.
Yeah, and if I move forward, all good?
All good.
Okay, well, do just interrupt if there are any issues with sound or visuals.
Sure, and just let you know, Vicky, and also the audience, if you have any questions for Vicky, please drop them in the YouTube live chat, and then at the end of Vicky's talk as well, I'll relay them back to you. So that's that we'll go ahead, and so I'll drop off the camera now and sit back and enjoy the talk. So take it away. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, and sorry for the slight delay in starting. So it's a real pleasure to be here talking to you about one of my absolute favourite kind of archival subjects. Essentially what I'm going to be talking to you about is this kind of what I'm calling a hidden archive of letters, love letters between men in the National Archives collections. So firstly, a brief content warning. This presentation will reference historic homophobic attitudes, particularly in terms of past state legislation and policing practices. And the presentation will also use words from the time at moments when I'm kind of directly quoting from the records. And some of these words are now considered outdated or offensive. But I'm kind of using them to be authentic to the records. I'll also use the word queer in this talk, particularly because it's the most commonly used word that I've come across for men to self-describe their sexuality in the 1920s and 1930s, which is the period that I'm really focusing in on. And I'll also use the the term LGBTQ is more of an umbrella term to talk more generally about various sexual and gender identities and talk across time periods. So with those notes, let's get stuck into some of the content. In November 1920, the youthful Ernest, or Ernie Smith, was arrested. At 22 years old, he worked as a clerk in Belfast and described himself as 5'5" in height, of medium build, about 26-inch waist, with dark hair and blue eyes. He had an interest in art and literature. He loved the Pre-Raphaelites and Oscar Wilde, but abhorred ragtime jazz. So why was this young railway clerk arrested? Found in Ernie's possession were actually hundreds of letters, a handful of which survive. And the image on screen is just illustrative of kind of what would have survived. It's not actually an accurate representation, unfortunately. Problematically for Ernie, these letters were between himself and many other men, or as the police termed them, sodomites. These letters provided criminal evidence of Ernie's relationships with other men in a time when the law essentially criminalised their love. Even the sheer number of letters he was found with can essentially help us question some of our assumptions we might have about the past, showing that love letters and queer networks between men have always existed. So in the National Archives records are a small but ultimately unknown number of love letters between men. These love letters often read like they could be written between any lovers of any gender in any period. They openly display love, joy, and affection. So one example on screen here, a letter and a quote for you. I just want to be with your arms around me and soak myself in the atmosphere of contentment. But the letters we have from the 1920s and 30s are from a time when writing these words down was potentially incriminating. In our collections, there are these occasional rare love letters between men, but also letters between queer male friends, talking openly about their lives and their friendships. In this talk, what I really hope to do is give you back a little bit of the voice of people in the archives that often couldn't be heard in their own lifetime in their own words. So I'm going to try and do this by exploring 3 brief case studies where such letters between men materialise in our collections, including the case I started with of Ernie. What these letters show is kind of a normality almost that was possible for some queer people in the past, but also a defiance to love despite the restrictions imposed upon people. So firstly, for a little bit of context and scene setting. In the past, the state played a major role in repressing and controlling the lives of gay and bisexual men and women. And as the State Archive for England and Wales, the National Archives reflects much of this negative history. So that's very much the context that the bulk of our records relating to LGBTQ lives comes from. Now, this attempt by the state to suppress sexuality in the past has actually left us with many potential sources for the experiences of LGBTQ individuals, from court records, witness statements, sometimes personal items that were seized in maybe police raids or similar things, and even these letters that I'm talking about today. In an era where keeping personal items about love between men was done at great personal risk, these letters offer a really unique insight into the lives of queer men before partial decriminalisation. So if criminalisation is the reason we have these items, conversely, it's the reason we don't have these kind of items about same-sex relationships between women or individuals we might now consider to be trans. It was not illegal to be a lesbian or to subvert your gender identity, although society made neither of these things easy for people. The absence of policing of lesbian and trans identities leads to an absence of archival items in our collections, including an absence of comparative love letters, similar to the ones I'm talking about today. So they just don't exist in the same way in our collections. While we do have records about lesbian and transgender lives, some of the examples can be seen of those on screen. They're less common and often more found in genealogical collections or personal papers. And although I really hope one day to be able to find, for example, love letters between women, at the moment they certainly seem like they're kind of undiscovered in our collections. So that's just really to explain why this talk today is so focused on love letters between men. Very much it's dictated by what survives in our collections. So back to Ernie, our clerk from Belfast. These men who'd written to him letters from all over the country had supposedly got in contact with Ernie through their classified adverts in a publication called The Link, which can be seen on screen. The Link was a Lonely Heart style publication from the 1920s that sought to connect people. And in practice, it was used kind of against its original purpose to include, to connect many LGBT people. In October 1920, Ernie had placed a personal advertisement in The Link containing just the following few words. Youth, island, 18, fond of music, literature, well educated, refined, desires sincere friend, own sex, any age to 35, all letters answered. In his allocated 25 words, Ernie had dropped in certain words and phrases and hints. Music, literature, sincere friend, and most significantly, own sex. These words would serve both as a coded signal of his desire to meet other men, but also ultimately to incriminate him. So we can follow Ernie's relationship with one of these individuals pretty closely. We can follow his relationship with Jeffrey or Jeff Smith, an ex-serviceman from Enfield. Because of Jeff's proximity to London, the Metropolitan Police requested that the Belfast Police send Ernie's and Jeff's correspondence to the Met, which leads to these letters' survival in our collections, and the ones that survives are really kind of just a handful, but they're still really quite informative. In our collections, just to clarify, we hold Metropolitan Police records, but not other police records from across the country. So that's why it's kind of quite unique that we have these ones. So the pair appear to have initiated contact on the 12th of September 1920, when Jeff wrote to Ernie saying, "I feel sure we would be able to become excellent friends." The letters sent between them over a number of months provide a picture of their friendship and relationship. The Link and some subsequent letters gave them a chance to correspond, despite the significant distance between Enfield and Belfast. Through their vivid and open correspondence, we can see that Ernie and Jeff pursued a relationship, although whether they were ever able to actually meet is unclear. The intention, however, is clear. They talk about their fondness for each other and their mutual attraction. The letters also recount their sexual dalliances with other men in what appears to almost be a kind of competitive attempt to make each other jealous. In one of the letters, Jeff writes longingly, "May the time soon come, Ernie, when we can meet and allow our sensuality to have full swing with each other." On the 2nd of October 1920, the correspondence continued. "I'm longing to revel in the joys of your naked body." So we also see queer people gathering in person rather than just this kind of more distant form of connection. And we see this in both private houses and clubs. Within these spaces, letters were occasionally found. Sometimes these letters were found with their intended recipient, and sometimes with the original author, never to have actually been sent. 9 letters and a Christmas card were found at 25 Fitzroy Square, London in 1927. This basement flat was home to Bobby and Constance, where they would hold parties for a small group of their working class friends. Inside the flat, the individuals were observed to be dancing, singing, kissing, and cuddling, and sometimes naked. Bobby, a professional dancer on the West End stage, would perform dances for his friends in costume. The gramophone would keep them entertained for hours. This was essentially a space where people had the freedom to be themselves away from some of society's pressures, particularly the pressures around conforming to society's ideas of sexuality at the time. After weeks of observation by the police, this flat was unfortunately raided in 1927 under the accusations of being a disorderly house, and this was very much because of the same-sex activity between men going on inside the flat. The letters were written to Bobby and Bert, who were both present during the raid. In the photograph, Bobby is wearing the long kind of gender transgressive skirt and is bare-chested. and Bert is wearing the kind of 1920s style swimming costume. Bert was the nephew of Bobby and said to police that he often stayed at the Fitzrovia flat at weekends. Bobby was teaching him to dance. During the raid on the venue, their photographs were seized as potential evidence alongside, the letters were seized as potential evidence alongside the photographs, which you can see on screen, and also other items. So the other items don't survive, but we do know originally that some of the outfits and costumes that people were wearing were also seized as well. Photographs with people in, such as these, are really rare to survive. So we sometimes see them in lists of evidence, but this is a really rare surviving example. You can also see the names that have been annotated of individuals above their heads in the photograph, and they were added by police. On screen is an image of the original handwritten letters seized during the raid, but we also have typed up versions as well as the kind of handwritten versions on the headed paper. These letters don't just tell us about love, but also about queer friendships and international networks. One of Bobby's friends, known as McNamara, we aren't given his first name, had not long moved to America and wrote to him regularly from there saying, "We can still write to each other in sincere friendship, and when I come back, you'll be the first I come and see." McNamara's letters give some really fascinating details about their lives. They're filled with wonderful, affectionate nicknames, queer humour, which at times is wonderfully lewd, and also an underlying love and companionship between friends that stretches between Bobby and McNamara across the Atlantic. These letters start from the time of McNamara's initial journey and arrival in America in 1922. He described his life prior to this being one of a poor working harlot from the streets of London. While writing these letters, he is traveling extensively, mentioning San Francisco, New Orleans, California, and at one point describing his dear Bobby as the campus thing between London and San Francisco. One of the most revealing parts of these letters is the relationship that McNamara develops in America, using many phrases associated more with kind of heterosexual relationships and marriage, such as husband, marriage, and honeymoon. Despite this being many decades before same-sex marriage was legalized, they were still very much conceptualizing their relationship in these terms. McNamara described his husband, Harry, as a real lover, but also calls him jealous and stubborn. "Harry won't let me go to work. It really is dreadful, as I'm cultivating such extravagant tastes." One of the standout things from these letters is the terms of address the pair used towards each other, such as Lady of the Camellias, my dearest camping Bessie, you brazen harlot, and old Auntie Aggie. An obvious campness and humour shines through. Police paid particular attention to any mentions of kind of alternative gender expression, such as McNamara writing to Bobby, "My dear sister, one day you must come over," and the wonderful sign-off, "Yours as ever, your old drunken Auntie Elizabeth. Kisses and kind thoughts to Sister Nellie." A theme in several of these letters to Bert and Bobby is the queer scene in London and the rich possibilities of socialising that 1920s London offered, which went significantly beyond their private gatherings at Fitzroy Square. One of the letters received was from Leslie Kinder, who had worked at the Adelphi Rooms as a waiter, aged 26, and wrote to Bobby from Brixton Prison following his imprisonment after the raid there. He had been sentenced to 21 months hard labour. So this shows some of the connections between the different spaces, that Bobby was in communication with someone that worked at the Adelphi Rooms and had been arrested there. In a letter from Bill to Bert, who's called Honey Bunch in the letter, the pair are looking to meet and go out. Bill states they can easily find a dance, and there are plenty of dances, so don't forget to come, suggesting a thriving queer scene at the time, despite the underground nature of it. And indeed, you can see some of the images on screen of some of the spaces that were available. So the Adelphi Rooms that I've already mentioned, but also the Chelsea Arts Ball, as well, and Lady Malcolm's servants' balls that were quite transgressive at the time, with working class people often cross-dressing and things like that in quite public spaces like the Royal Albert Hall. So there were spaces available for people. These two very different references in the letters demonstrate the risks and opportunities these spaces offered at the time. The seized letters addressed to Bert are predominantly love letters. They show some of the complexities of love between men, including unrequited love. One letter from Eric is written in several stages at different points in the day and is kind of quite an intense, heartfelt expression of someone in love but not being loved back. You say that you could never love me, but that you can offer me friendship, which you say is far greater than love. I cannot agree with you about this, my dear. I must confess that I don't see how I can keep love out of my side of the friendship. It's a simple, true fact that I love you, baby dear. So that was Eric writing to Bert in 1927. Eric also continues, I have an intense desire to make you happy. I worship the beauty of your body and your dear, dear face and hair and eyes, and I want to hold you very close to me. However, it seems that Bert only wants friendship. As Eric writes, we're all foolish sometimes when it comes to matters of the heart. A letter sent after this date seems to be between Eric and Peter, and this letter talks of the frustration of not being able to speak publicly about their feelings. I wanted to shout to the whole of the office that I was in love with you. This underlines that while relationships were certainly possible between men, they had to be secretive and hidden from work and family, and that obviously put a lot of pressure on individuals. The versions of these letters held in the National Archives collections contain markings from the police. The authorities indicated the sections they found particularly concerning by underlining them in green and red. Even the forms of address and sign-off could be problematic in the eyes of the law. Affectionate nicknames could be read as a sign of homosexuality or transgression when written between men, such as the sign-offs, Peter Darling, Honey Love, My Baby Dear, and always just Eric, with a kiss. The nature of having records because of the raids means that we only have one side of the conversation, and that's different from the case of Ernie and Jeff, who we had both sides because of the way the letters were sent to police. So this really leaves us with many questions. How did Bert really feel about his heartbroken correspondent? What was Bobby writing in his return letters about his life in London? Maybe he spoke about his gatherings he held at Fitzroy Square. Maybe prior to moving to America, McNamara actually attended these gatherings as well. So lots of questions remain unanswered. The final letters I want to explore with you relate to a brilliant club. The first two examples of letters here have been from the 1920s. So now we're kind of shifting to the 1930s. Here we see a hidden network of spaces across London, such as private members' clubs, pubs, bathhouses, restaurants, and dance halls that provided a relatively safe space where men could meet other men regardless of the law. There was an undeniable, thriving queer scene, often quite bohemian, flamboyant, gender subversive, fun, and camp. And that's not to say that these spaces would have been available to everyone. They came with significant risk. Some of them would have had certain class dynamics at play. The price might have been prohibitive to people attending, but ultimately these spaces did exist. The 1930s saw more and more of these clubs thrive, disappear, and pop up again. And just to name a few examples, there was Billy's Club that opened in 1935. This club was very much centered around music hall artists and openly featured queer musicians such as Fred Barnes, who was very well known at the time. The Shinshan Club opened in 1935 as well on Wardour Street. This was a club really known as London's miniature Harlem, and it championed African-American music on the jazz scene at the time. And it was essentially a rare Black queer space, so really quite unique. And when it got shut down, it kind of reopened as the Rainbow Reef. So a very kind of resilient space that, that clearly there was demand to reopen. And in the 1930s, we can see Holland Park Ballroom that was rented out for drag dances. And this was one of the costumes worn by one of the individuals in attendance at one of those drag dances. And that actually survives in our collections, which is a really rare example of an actual costume that survives as well. But the particular club I'm focusing in on is the Caravan Club, which was a key venue in the era, a bohemian haven for gay men. Connected with this club are two particularly important letters in our collection. So the Caravan Club was essentially a makeshift private members club in the basement of 81 Endell Street on the edge of Soho. And it was described as London's greatest bohemian rendezvous. And it says that on the ticket on screen. The club was owned by Jack Neave, known as Ironfoot Jack, and William Reynolds, known as Billy. For the price of 1 shilling for members and 1 shilling 6 on the door, all-night gaiety could be enjoyed while dancing to the music of Charlie, the club's accordion player. And it was actually only open for 6 weeks, this venue. And I think you can kind of see that in the images that it's quite makeshift and bohemian, feels like it's been pulled together in a rush. In the venue, it was noted that the small dance floor was crowded and the number was too large to allow dancing properly. Men were dancing with men and women with women. So we have these fantastic photographs of the interior of the Caravan Club. Although they're black and white, you can possibly imagine the kind of colours that might have been in there, the muted tones, the rich tones. But also I think it's important to note that we see these photographs devoid of people. They were taken after the raid on the venue took place, but actually at the time this would have been filled with people when it was open, and the space at in the foreground of the photo was the dance floor, so that really would have been packed full of people. Now, in the early hours of the morning on the 25th of August 1934, a number of plainclothes policemen entered the club pretending to be visitors. They then raided the venue. Among the police witness statements, reports and photographs of the raid and trial are personal letters that were used as evidence in court. And these demonstrate a fascinating and unusually personal reflection on what it meant to be queer at the time. So the first letter we have was addressed from Cyril to his darling Morris, and it was found at the scene of the raid. The author Cyril was just 22 and writes, "I was very disappointed that you were not coming to the club tonight," and describes counting the hours until I could see you. It signifies the importance of the Caravan Club as a space where Cyril could be himself and meet with Morris. Although the letter seems to indicate that Cyril is keener on Morris than he is in return. Queer heartache is a common theme, is as common a theme in these letters as queer love, which I think is interesting and underlies how relatable they are. They have the full range of emotions that any other love letters would have as well. Very little is known about Cyril, Morris and their relationship, other than what is contained in the letter. Cyril ends by writing, "I only wish that I was going away with you, just you and I, to eat, sleep and make love together." As the club was being raided, Cyril ripped up the letter and hid it under a divan. It was pieced together and typed up into its current format by police. And that's why there's a kind of note in the top right-hand corner that says Exhibit 4 on there. Another letter was found in a hotel bedroom on the Isle of Wight, connected to the Caravan Club case in a follow-up raid. And it was found just in the following weeks after that. And it tells us a little bit more about Cyril. It was written from Cyril to his dear friend Billy, the owner of the Caravan Club. The letter describes how he has only been queer since coming to London 2 years ago, showing the importance of London to his sense of identity. The letter also reveals that he has a wife and a little girl, and says that he is still interested in women occasionally. So I think this is a really interesting, rare insight into how someone self-defines in their own language, and also an open declaration of bisexuality, which tends to be particularly hidden in archival records. Normally, we only really get a kind of snapshot of someone's life, and we don't see that full context in their description of how they feel about their sexuality themselves. And in this case, we have the original letter in our collections and the envelope it was delivered in as well. The letter ends with the powerful words, "Please be a dear boy and destroy this note." Cyril, as with every other letter writer in this presentation, was only too aware of the implications if it was found. So I've covered these cases in kind of chronological order, and each case I think really brings something different in terms of what the letters can tell us. There's similarities that you can draw across the letters, but also quite distinct differences. So more distant kind of forms of correspondence, reflections on queer friendships, and also personal reflections on identity as well. I've intentionally chosen very much to give the letters the spotlight and to focus in on them, using police records primarily to talk about these emotional items rather than the policing itself. So kind of using the content of these records against the grain of their original purpose to really try and give people their voices back, I guess, in the archival material. However, because of when these authors were writing, there were of course consequences to these illicit gatherings and secret correspondence and communication. So I just briefly want to revisit each case in turn. Ultimately, Ernie and Jeff, who met through the link, were arrested under the charge of conspiring to commit gross indecency. They were tried at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, and indeed that's, I believe, the court used in all of these occasions, showing the kind of prominence of these cases. So they were charged along with 2 other men, and they each received 2 years imprisonment with hard labour at Wormwood Scrubs. In the case of Bobby and Bert, we know that while we have the letters, they were sent, preserved in our collections, they were not actually used as evidence in court. Newspaper reports show that Sir Henry Curtis Bennett, QC, believed they ought never to have been admitted as evidence, as they could not properly be connected with the offence the appellants were charged with. After all, these letters were not directly connected to the charge in question of a disorderly house, and some of these letters significantly predated the raid by several years, such as the letters received by Mcguire. However, Sir Henry did concede that the letters were clearly, and I quote, of an obscene character. Although the letters were dismissed as evidence in court, Bobby received a sentence of 15 months hard labour, and Bert received 8 months in the 2nd Division. In the raid on the Caravan Club, 103 individuals, both men and women, were arrested and taken to Bow Street Police Station, including Cyril. During his arrest, Cyril had to undergo the humiliating process of having his face tested for evidence of makeup with blotting paper. And this is a reoccurring practice we see in these records. Cyril also boldly approached the police inspector during the raid in an extraordinary act of defiance, saying to him, "Well, I don't mind this beastly raid, but I would like to know if you can let me have one of your nice boys to come home with. I am really good." The majority of individuals who were arrested were some of whom were labourers, some of whom were shop assistants or waiters, were found not guilty on the condition that they never frequent the club, such a club again. Cyril was committed to trial for aiding and abetting in the keeping of a disorderly house and found not guilty, despite the use of these letters, which were very open, as evidence. The club owners were alternatively sentenced to hard labour for 20 and 12 months, respectively. So I'm just going to try and wrap up some of the final threads from these cases. So in most cases, we know little of what ultimately happened to the individuals after their time in court. After all, these individuals were not famous, just average, often working class men who dared to love and live their sexual lives fully. Sometimes authors would use false names. Sometimes the letters authors would use false names and addresses to evade the law, which also makes them tricky to trace. In the case of Cyril, Ernie and Jeff, I've generally been quite unsuccessful in tracing them. So on the 1921 census, we do see Ernie and Jeff. They're still in prison at the time, listed in Wormwood Scrubs. This stint in prison may have even been the only chance they got to meet, assuming they did indeed meet during their time there. After this imprisonment, there's no clear evidence that they ever met again or certainly continued to pursue a relationship. Cyril went by the pseudonym Cyril Coeur de Lion or Cyril the Lionheart. At the time of his arrest, he was listed as living on independent means, and the names of his wife and child are unknown. So there's kind of quite little information to cross-reference there. I've yet to be able to trace him beyond this moment in time. For Bobby and Bert and the authors of the letters they received to their Fitzroy Square flat, we know a little more. Records show that not long after their prison sentence in 1929, both Bobby and Bert travelled to New York. I like to think they got to visit McNamara, author of so many of the letters to Bobby, to meet his husband, travel the states, and to continue to develop their wonderful queer friendships. And we've got just an image of them travelling together on their passenger lists. The 1939 register does show Bobby listed as single and living in Paddington. He also remained a professional dancer. In their letters, Ernie and Jeff talk openly about their frustrations with the law. So this is them writing in 1920. I cannot understand why it should be considered a criminal offence for two people of the same sex who are fond of each other and mutually agreed to commit sodomy. It would take a further 40 years for the state to partially decriminalise homosexual acts. Essentially, it's likely that 22-year-old Ernie would have lived the majority of his life having to hide his sexuality from the law and wider society. For Bobby, on the other hand, records show he lived to the age of 100. He'd been born in 1900 and would have lived through many changes in the law. For a significant period of Bobby's life, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act would have been in force, decriminalising homosexual acts in private. So in conclusion, these letters now provide a remarkable and rare insight into LGBTQ lives in the 1920s and 1930s. They tell stories of love and friendship, but also of criminalisation. They illustrate that these relationships went beyond metropolitan areas traditionally associated with LGBTQ life, spreading all over the UK and beyond. But they also leave us with many questions. How many men felt able to take such risks in corresponding? How many letters don't survive in police collections because people were able to evade the law? Or how many letters were burned or destroyed through fear? How many women's experiences of same-sex love existed or exist in letters, and how do they differ? And fundamentally, what still exists in collections, in other archives, in people's attics even, waiting to be found? Despite the reason they were kept, these wonderful letters can tell us huge amounts about the queer community and LGBTQ networks at the time. They reflect many different emotions, reciprocated and unreciprocated love, romance and friendship between men, and navigating a queer identity in an era that essentially criminalised your love. These letters highlight the risks gay men were willing to take, their bold defiance in the face of the law, and the universality of love that can be found in these pages. There are so many little known stories to be told about LGBTQ history at the National Archives, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. So as well as records around criminalisation and defiance, we also see things around censorship, and particularly in relation to lesbian lives. There were records about people's work for government, LGBT people working for government, for example, Chevalier de Aon, one of the earliest known cases of a gender non-conforming individual in our collections. The work of people like Alan Turing means that he intersects with our collections. There are everyday reasons that people come into our records in relation to their LGBT kind of experiences. So the will of Eleanor Butler, one of the ladies of Llangollen, the change of name of Elton John, the naturalization certificate of Freddie Mercury, all sorts of reasons. And then increasingly we get records about campaigning in the law and more kind of positive change. So records around those themes as well. So there's absolutely tons to explore beyond just the kind of the letters in the collection as well. And more can be found through our blogs, podcasts. We've got a LGBTQ podcast episode, and through our social media channels as well. And as I focus really in this talk on the 1920s, I thought I would just flag our current exhibition. called The 1920s Beyond the Raw, which looks at the rich diverseness of the 1920s. That's a free exhibition on site, but there's lots of online programming linked to it as well, including a tour of the exhibition space on YouTube and various online events. So if you're interested, I'd recommend signing up to our mailing list to find out more. So essentially, thank you very much for listening. And I'm now very willing to take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicky. That was really wonderful. And yes, please do check out that exhibition. I was lucky enough to get to the last exhibition in the National Archives that Vicky also worked on, and I believe was one of those letters at least was in that exhibition, right? Which one was it?
That was the Cyril and Morris one, yeah. The kind of love letter from the Caravan Club. It was hard to choose which one to pick for that. Yeah,
I can imagine. So you don't have any questions yet, so please do get them in if you have one. But we do have a very nice comment from Richard O'Leary. Hello, Richard. Richard says, thanks so much, Vicky, for your fascinating presentation, and especially for highlighting the range of emotions felt by these men. 1926 census, when available, may tell us more about Ernie and Jeff.
Yes,
and I think that is really interesting, how you use, and how scholars now are using more and more family history to sort of, read it against the grain, like looking at a ship manifest, which of course is initially a very dry source. You might think very technical, but actually when you can kind of contextualize it like you do, you can really find quite amazing stories.
Yeah, definitely.
Question I had when you were speaking was about whether you have any sense of a kind of a broader social history around when people are prosecuted, are there kind of, it struck me as remarkable kind of the efforts that the police went to in a way. And was there a kind of specific moral panics in certain years that led to there being the more source material being generated than, let's say, in other years?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair observation. The police themselves get quite a bit of backlash because they're seen to be kind of, it's almost borderline entrapment with some of the situations. And so actually, even the Home Office at the time isn't particularly keen on the approach. I mean, it's quite interesting seeing some of the observations by police particularly in the clubs and venues, where they would literally pretend to be patrons and get quite involved in the situation. So I think it wasn't without its controversy, but I do think you see kind of some of these flashpoints where there was definitely more of a focus on kind of queer lives at the time. But I think that, yeah, there might also be kind of other reasons behind that, and the main points that we have records, as wonderful as the letters are, I think it's relatively unlikely we'll find many more. And in a way, that's a good thing. It's, that people's lives weren't policed in that way as much as they are fascinating. I think they're more kind of rare examples rather than the norm.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, it's interesting. I'd also love to know whether we can kind of read a geography of this as well. I thought it was interesting, the Isle of Wight, and here I'm also here in Belfast at the moment researching how this was policed in Northern Ireland. So I guess as more research is done, we can kind of try and pick out different kind of geographical particularities, but also common points. And it'd be interesting kind of map arrests and prosecutions across the UK to see how that played out.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have a particular bias in our collections because we have the London Metropolitan Police records and not other ones. And that is a frustrating bias because it leads to an even more kind of London-centric view. But when we look at publications like The Link, something like that has far more examples than, say, the kind of more unique examples of the love letters, just people putting their kind of 25-word kind of classified adverts in there. They come from all over the country and beyond. So I think with something like that, you can really see a kind of a geographical spread of people that were interested in meeting.
Mm.
So yeah, it's not, like I say, I think the love letters in some instances are more rare, so it's harder to map them like that, and they're very much specific to Metropolitan Police records in our collection. But more generally, I think it would be brilliant to try and map, and records like the link really help us to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. So there's a question and another nice comment. So beginning with the comment, Atlas O'Hare notes, that was so fascinating, Vicky. I hope more can be uncovered someday from the perspective of women. That would be amazing to see. And then a question from Fintan McCarthy, who asks, have you found examples in other archives, for example, in Ireland or Europe or the US?
So in terms of other archives, I haven't. I tend to be quite rooted to the National Archives collections because of my role. But I would love the opportunity to explore more. So maybe that's something I can look into, kind of a way that I could do that more, because I do think there would be a huge richness in that, to look at those networks. And I'm particularly interested, I think, to try and trace McNamara in America and see what happened to him and his partner. So I think there's definitely lots of potential, which I'd be keen to explore. In terms of women's records, I think we often end up just using different records. So increasingly, I've been using records like wills to kind of read into queer relationships between women. They obviously don't have quite the personality that shines through of these kind of 1920s records, but there's still a lot of potential there, I think. So I think thinking outside the box is really helpful for some of those less represented identities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I'm always banging the drum about wills. I think wills are underutilized. I know at least any I've had to use, I've needed to spend a tenner to access each one, but it's worth it because, you know, it's obviously very meaningful who you leave your estate to, and it can tell a great deal. And in the cases where I've used it, I've actually been able to find who has inherited the materials. So that's been really useful too. We should close up soon because we're going to transition to the last talk. So if anyone has any questions, do get them in now. Before that, thanks so much, Vicky. That was really, really fascinating. It's strange, you know, to find the adjective for it, because you want to say wonderful, but there's also such a, you know, there's such a sadness and a tragedy behind how the material exists at all. So, you know, it is difficult to find the right words for it, but it's certainly an extremely rich story that you've been able to tell with it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk about. So thank you.
Great. So I think we'll come back then at 6 for our final talk, which is Sarah Phillips speaking about Ireland and the road to gender recognition 1990 to 2015. So everyone can go ahead and make a tea or anything. And finally, thanks again, Vicky. So just feel free to just log off as normal. That was brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Great. And I will also close off my camera until 6 and make myself a mug of tea. Hi, James. I think Sarah's having some trouble getting in. Could you see if she is in the waiting room?
Not at the moment.
Hold on, let me send another link. Yeah, Sarah's still saying she's unable to get in. Hold on.
The only restriction was you have to be logged into Zoom.
Okay. Maybe that. Oh, hold on 1 second. See if she logs in. Hi everyone, apologies for the delay. Should be with you in a few minutes, just figuring out tech issues once again. Hey everyone. Just waiting again for Sarah to join. I think we've got it figured out now. So it should just be another moment. Great. Hello. Good to see you again, Sarah. How are you?
Not too bad. So sorry.
No, don't worry. Don't worry. It's the nature of these things. Right. So we will start into then. We're live now, Sarah, just to let you know. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our final session of Epic Irish Emigration Museum's Out in the Past Hub. And joining us is Sarah Phillips for the talk, Ireland and the Road to Gender Recognition, 1990 to 2015. So to remind everyone, and also to explain for Sarah, for Q&A, people are watching in on a YouTube live, and they can leave questions in the live chat, which I can then relay back to you at the end of the talk. So without further ado, Sarah, if you'd like to, you can share slides if you have any, or not, just take it away, and I'll drop off and sit back and enjoy the talk. So thanks.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to try and share my screen if that's okay. That should be it. Hopefully everybody can see that.
That was perfect. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the delay and the trying to get in to speak to you all this evening. So this evening I want to talk about the Ireland and the Road to Gender Recognition, 1990 to 2015. But in preparing this talk, I have decided also to try and bookend it with a little bit of information leading up to 1990, and also what has happened since, just to kind of finish it out a little bit. So first of all, I just want to leave you with this, or start off with this statement. Behind this legal case, there is a story of great human proportions, which unfortunately this judgment in a court of law is unable to adequately portray or properly recreate. And that sentence came from Justice Lee McKechnie in the Dr. Lydia Foy case in 2007, in 2002. And the problem, I think, is that while we're about to talk about gender recognition and a legal process and an act of law, in reality, this has quite a very serious effect on individuals' lives. And I'll touch on that as I go through Dr. Foy's own case when I get it to that. But to start off, just to give you an idea, and I've said many times when I've spoken here on behalf of the Irish Trans Archive, there are a lot of different trans people throughout history in Ireland. We didn't just come out of the woodwork in the last 10 years. In fact, these are just some of the individuals and colourful individuals that are actually Irish and have straddled the globe over the past 200 to 300 years. And you can go and check them out yourself. There's some really interesting stories. They are some of the better known ones. However, we do have a lot of other names which I'm currently trying to research, and hopefully we will have a lot more information on some of these names when, as time moves on. So trans people have been here forever, and then why is gender recognition important, and why is the ability to be able to be recognized in the gender that you believe you are, but at a state level, why is that important? And over the past, prior to 1960, trans people were very much in the shadows. They were very much living in secret. They didn't really come out unless somebody outed them already. Some of those names that I mentioned earlier, if you look at them, Michael Dillon gets outed by the Daily Mail, I think it's the Daily Mail, if I remember rightly. Dr. James Barry gets outed upon his death. Edward de Lacy Evans gets outed when he has an accident. Albert Cashier gets run over by a car and again gets outed. And a lot of these stories are very much kept in the privacy of their own lives, and as they traverse life as best they can throughout that period of time. However, with the advent of surgery and medical care, we find in the 1950s that people like Christine Jorgensen, Roberta Cowell in the UK, all start to have a much more public visibility to their lives because the media find out about what's happening to them and they start to talk about them and start to write about them. However, something that occurs as that publicity and as that visibility happens, trans people start to become more, I suppose, colorful. People start to see their lives in a very different way. And within UK law, there is a simple administrative process prior to the 1960s to be able to change your birth certificate. And the reason why I've put up this slide, which is a slide of April Ashley, who's a very revered and well-known trans woman from Liverpool. April Ashley gets married to her then husband, Mr. Corbett, who happens to be coming from, I suppose, the lower aristocracy in the UK. And they have a reasonably, happy kind of initial part to their marriage. However, as time moves on, Mr. Corbett decides he doesn't want to be married to April anymore. And rather than having to go through a divorce where he would have to provide 50% of his wealth to her, he decides to try and take a legal case to say that April was never female in the first place. And it's quite a controversial case in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And by 1970, a judge finds that actually, in favor of Mr. Corbett, that actually April is considered within law still a man. And you'll see the horrible headline on the right-hand side there. And this is quite controversial because there are a number of trans people who at that point had started to get married. They were starting to settle down, have their private lives without the attention of the press. However, April's, I suppose April's visibility brought this, and also the legal case itself brought this, the attention of the press, quite a lot. And it's quite well reported during 1970 when the case is found in February 1970. So it changes the status of trans people as we go, and the way they are treated then moving forward into the 70s, they're seen very, very differently, because prior to that, you were seen as the gender that you presented. So during the 1970s, the trans community are starting to come back, are starting to form communities. They're starting to get in touch with each other. They're starting to form groups. You see groups in the UK or in Ireland starting to form one such group, which was formed in 1966 in the UK. It was called the Beaumont Society, and similarly then in Dublin, the Friends of Ian. And the Friends of Ian start to advocate for not just rights, but also social acceptance. I'm not going to try and take too long on this because we want to get to gender recognition specifically. As the 1980s happens throughout the UK, and I'm focusing specifically on the UK here because obviously Ireland during that period of time very much looked to the UK and what they were doing and how trans people were seen in the UK, and especially in the UK media. Late in the 1980s, Caroline Cossey, who at the time was a very, well-known model, and had been outed. She'd been, for instance, she'd been in a James Bond movie. She'd been modeling in some of the catwalks in Europe. She'd been in various different newspapers modeling. And she was not only, first of all, was a well-known model, but then she was outed again by the press. However, at a point during the late 1980s, she wants to marry her boyfriend. And because the UK has clearly changed this law back in 1970 with April Ashley's case, Caroline decides to take the legal case against the British government, but then which goes all of the way to the European Court of Human Rights. I'm afraid Caroline's case is lost, and at that point there is nothing really can change, and she is not allowed to marry her boyfriend. So, sorry, just one moment. Wait. Bob's not moving here. So, however, she had been granted a passport with female on it in 1976, and this was one of the arguments. She wanted, marry her boyfriend at that point, and felt that this identification document would allow her to do that. However, again, similar to Ireland, the fundamental document of identification is the birth certificate, and therefore, because her birth certificate still remained male, she was not allowed to change it, not allowed to change it and then get married. So we see throughout then a campaign by the trans community to start looking for what's then known as legal recognition. And a small group of people, namely Press for Change, is formed in the UK in 1992. And it begins to advocate for both, not only equality for all trans people in the UK, but also legal recognition. So the idea of legal recognition is formulated at that point. And Press for Change, formed by Mark Rees and Stephen Whittle, two trans men, and aided by other trans women, Christine Burns, Angela Clayton, and Claire McNabb, and many other activists throughout that period of time, start to advocate and lobby and formulate what it means to have recognition and to be recognized in the gender of your preferred gender. And we start to see this idea that trans people are going to advocate for their legal rights. As part of that, Press for Change then support a number of different cases to try and move the issue forward within the courts. And they support, for instance, two cases that eventually end up in the Strasbourg court again in 2002, and I'll come back to that again in a minute. I mean, this was the idea that trans people were not only coming together and creating community groups, but actually coming together and creating an advocacy group that was going to, lobby at the highest level of government and advocate for their rights and show why it was necessary, was very different and very new in both in the UK and Ireland at that point in time. So we come to the heroine or the hero of the hour, Dr. Lydia Foy. So in the late 1980s, Dr. Foy transitions, realizes that she has no documentation that provides her with her identity, because all her documentation, her passport, back then her driver's license, her birth certificate, all have male on her, on those documents, and she needs to be able to look at being able to traverse life, going, whether she travels or not, whether she goes to social services, whether she needs to get a driver's license, etc. Every time it's an embarrassment that she has to out herself to explain why her documentation is wrong. So Dr. Foy in 1993 writes to the Registrar General. And the reason why she writes to the Registrar General is because, as you'll see on the right-hand side, a copy of the letter of response that she gets from Patrick Keogh, coherent, like, well, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, sorry, at this time of night, but the Registrar General, the response she gets is basically that there's no mechanism within Irish law to be able to make a change that she's requesting, and that they will keep her letter on file, and that her application is currently being considered. Now, that application obviously is denied for nearly 22 years. So Dr. Foy starts to look at how, on that refusal, how she can move things forward. And she approaches the Free Legal Advice Centres, otherwise known as FLAC, and FLAC advise her that the only way that she can actually change any of her documentation is by changing her birth certificate, which, as I said earlier, is the fundamental document of identity here in Ireland. So when she does that, they recommend that she takes a legal case against the Irish state to try and see how she can get her documentation changed. And Dr. Foy is not really looking for necessarily a birth certificate. She's looking for some sort of documentation, whether it's a passport, whether it's a driver's license, anything at all will do. And again, that's an important specific detail that, I'll touch on again later on, because, she starts out on a trek, a 22-year trek, to change her birth certificate in order to get a passport or a driver's license or some other documentation that you might have that you can actually show if somebody asks for identification. So between 1992 and 1993 and 1997, a lot of the groundwork then is prepared by FLAC and Dr. Foy's legal team, and it becomes very clear that they need to take a case. And in 1997, they set proceedings forward. And that case comes to court in October 2000 and was heard over 14 days in the High Court by Justice Lee McKechnie, the man I mentioned earlier on, who plays a pivotal role in this legal case. And Dr. Foy argued, that while on one level she may have been physically male, that she was mentally or female, and at that point, had been born physically male, that at that point that she was both mentally and physically female and should be recognized as such. So that case is heard over, as I say, 14 days, but the judgment actually is reserved and isn't heard until July 2002, at which point Justice McKechnie rejects Dr. Foy's claim. And again, like previously in the UK court with Corbett versus Corbett, held that the physical and biological indicators should be used to determine sex and gender. In the case of Corbett and Corbett, they went to the European Court of Human Rights. And at that point, when Dr. Foy was refused, she decided, her legal team decided to review the situation and maybe consider also taking a legal case against the Irish state in the Strasbourg court. And ironically, on the day after that she wins or loses that case, the court finds in Strasbourg for Goodwin and another case which is known as I, they find that actually both of those cases 2 days later on the 11th of July, and in both cases the court unanimously held that the UK had breached the rights of trans women, Miss Christine Goodwin and Miss I, by failing to recognise them in their female gender and by refusing to let them marry in that gender. So Dr. Foy then decided to, the legal team decided to appeal. However, upon that appeal, they realised that actually there was still no mechanism within Irish law, and therefore they would have to maybe consider taking a second case rather than necessarily trying to go ahead with that appeal. So on one level, they let the appeal run, and then the second one was they took a legal case based on the judgment of Goodwin versus Goodwin, Corbett versus Corbett in the European Court of Human Rights. So in the meantime, Dr. Foy's life has been thrown upside down. You know, a lot of journalists were following the case, saying some horrible things about her. They were doorstepping her in her home, and they were discussing her life. Her family at this point had also abandoned her, had left. They disowned her and cut off all contact. And in fact, the opposition, the state, tried to bring her family into the court to fight the case against her. So it took a huge toll on her mental health at this point in time, but she was determined, and as she will say herself, the reason why she was determined was because she believed she would always have the right of reply, and therefore that her case should always be given that right. And throughout that first case, up until 2002, she never believed that she had been given the right of reply. So she continued that case, and they continued on fighting the argument. In 2005, they brought that case forward, and the court heard both the appeal and the second case. Well, they took another 2 years to make a decision. And at that point, Judge McKechnie again ruled for Dr. Foy. Sorry, just move forward slightly. Found that, gave his judgment of the second case, which is not the appeal, but the actual second case, that he granted a declaration under Irish law that it was incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights in failing to provide recognition for trans people. And the then government, Irish government, decided to appeal to the Supreme Court. However, it was rather stupid of them in one level, because Ireland had signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, and therefore, if it had have gone to eventually the Supreme Court and then the European Court of Human Rights, Dr. Foy, based on the Corbett and Corbett case, would have actually won the case, albeit that it would have been delayed. And as we always say, justice delayed is justice denied. So in 2007, Justice McKechnie fines for Dr. Foy and against the state. And in his finding on the day, he makes a very important statement, I think, that really should be considered across all aspects of Irish society. And in his summing up, he says, everyone as a member of society has the right to human dignity with individual personalities, has the right to develop his being as he sees fit, subject only to the most minimal of state interference being essential for the convergence of the common good. Together with human freedom, a person subject to the acquired rights of others should be free to shape his personality in the best way suited to his person and to his life. And I think this is what I think really underlines the whole idea of gender recognition, the ability to be recognized for who you are. With the incoming coalition government in 2010 and the then junior partner Labour make the part of their programme for government to drop the appeal and to implement some mechanism for transgender people to be able to change their gender on their birth certificate. And Minister John Burton decides to convene what is known as the Gender Recognition Advisory Group, better known to most of us as the GRAG, in 2010. There was lots of different problems with the GRAG in the sense that it went through the various different processes, the various different issues. It looked at other legislation from around the globe, and the more recent legislation in 2004, which had been enacted as part of that pressure that had been put on by Press for Change. And at that point was probably the most progressive piece of gender recognition legislation globally. It looked at other areas of the globe where gender recognition was available. It asked for submissions from which many trans individuals, small trans groups, LGBT groups, and wider civil society, such as the Free Legal Advice Centres, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, Amnesty International, all submitted their recommendations. However, one of the key things that occurred with the GRAG was that not all of both LGBT and trans groups and individuals and civil society were on the same page necessarily as to what should be provided by way of legislation. And we had various different degrees, such as the then legal recognition in the UK, which required 2 years living in role, approval of medical doctors, specific medical doctors, and the ability to go to what was known then as an expert panel and provide all your documentation in order to prove that you were trans enough in order to be recognized. Because of this, I suppose, disconnection between all the various different individual and groups that made submissions to the GRAG, it meant that the GRAG felt that actually the trans community themselves didn't know what they want. So what they did was they took the UK legislation and recommended that Ireland implement the exact same legislation. This didn't go down too well with many activists. It didn't go down too well with many trans groups. And in fact, at the launch of the GRAG by Minister Burton at the time, there was actually quite a lot of anger, and it didn't really help. So it also meant that people who were in existing marriages, for instance, couldn't, or civil partnerships would be forced to break up their marriages in order to be recognized, which was really causing serious hardship for families. However, that wasn't the end of the process. The community made a decision that they were going to come together so that everybody would be on the same page, and they would start to try and speak to government to understand what legislation had been already developing globally, because the UK legislation was now starting to be outstripped and passed over by other countries at that point. And there was a lot of talk about new ideas, specifically the idea that, both Press for Change back in 1992 had tried to push, and also the idea that some other countries had started to look at legislation for, and that was the idea of self-determination, the idea to decouple the medical requirements from a legal right. And the community, through a lot of different groups, as I said, FLAC, ICCL, Amnesty, TENI, Glen, who were then the LGBT main organization, all came together to try and talk about what it meant and what the trans community were really looking for. And one of the key moments of that early kind of advocacy was the Transgender Europe conference, which was held in Dublin in DCU in 2012, at which point Minister Burton was actually invited to be the keynote speaker. And during her speech, despite the fact of some protests and quite loud protests at that, Minister Burton, in her speech, actually said that trans people deserved and should have the right to self-determine their gender identity. It got lost a little bit, as I say, within the protests. It got lost within the noise. But however, there was a clear belief within government that we should look towards some sort of mechanism that provided self-determination. And so the trans community, specifically through TENI, started to mobilize and start to look towards trying to advocate. And as I said earlier, smaller trans groups start to look, such as Trans Education Advocacy, start to look at holding protests, specifically at the DCU conference, but also outside Leinster House, and start to talk in the media more and more about gender recognition and why self-determination was key. And what we have to look at in parallel to all of these conversations is that there's a global discussion going on in relation to medical care and the removal of what used to be known as gender identity disorder from the International Classification of Diseases to be changed to gender dysphoria, and what has now happened in more recent times to be moved out of the mental health area completely and into to be changed into to be known as sexual incongruence. So there's this constant moving of understanding of what it means to have a gender identity and to actually that it may be different to your assigned sex at birth. So that this understanding that being transgender was not a disorder and that we as a community and as individuals deserve to be recognized as we were. So, as I said earlier, there's quite a lot of movement at that point. One of the key decisions also was to work with some politicians about writing legislation that, you know, maybe would be putting forward the idea of what the trans community would hope for within legislation. And we had worked with Senator Catherine Zappone. We worked with Deputy Angus O'Shnoddig and Sinn Féin to produce pieces of legislation and put them forward both in the Dáil and the Seanad. And hopefully we could could we push the agenda so the government would therefore see what type of legislation could actually come into being. And we spoke many times. We tried to engage the media. We spoke at Pride marches, at marriage equality marches, and we tried to put out as much advertising, not advertising, but much promotion, and try to avail of any opportunity to talk about why it was increasingly harder for trans people to live their lives without the ability to change documentation and also then to be able to change your birth certificate. And what was key was that there were areas of the state that were allowing you to change certain documentation, such as your passport by now, but actually you couldn't change your birth certificate. So one of the key pieces of work in 2014 was an Amnesty International document, which was done both in Ireland, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And it was a report that came out called The State Decides Who I Am. And it clearly spoke to the needs of the community and the hardships that documentation and this lack of recognition was causing. And it focused, I think, the minds of politicians on what needed to be done. And you have to remember at this point, there is conversation going on around the marriage equality referendum is all about to kick off in early 2015. And therefore, a lot of these civil rights ideas are being discussed within government, but also within the body politic generally. So again, as I said earlier, the community through TENI specifically continue that advocacy, continue talking, taking opportunities to present to the Committee on Social Protection and Education, who are debating the introduction of legislation and the heads of bill that have been produced by Minister Joan Burton. And at that stage, it's about talking to as many different politicians to try and create as much support within the media, produce quite a lot of documentation whether it's around transgender young people and recognition, the medical criteria being asked. Because what happens is that within the heads of bill, the government are suggesting that while they want to recognize the ability of trans people to be given self-determination, they're asking for a signature to be put on the application. And the only people that can actually apply to, or sorry, the only people who can actually sign that document are actually medics. Medics, that there are very few people at that point in the country who can provide that signature. And at that point also it was a bottleneck that actually they were those people who you would have had to go and get diagnosed from, and therefore the medical criteria was not being removed from the legal right. However, in late 2014, Minister Burton gets promoted to Taoiseach and passes the responsibility for the legislation to the Minister for State, Kevin Humphreys. And the bill is finally published in December 14 and planned for debate in both the Seanad and the Dáil in early 15. The campaigning was stepped up. The community came out in force, allies, families, as much opportunity, to talk to people, to speak to people was taken. There's actually a very good moment where Minister Burton and Minister Humphreys and Rory Quinn, who was the Minister for Education at the time, meet with 3 families to understand the needs of younger people within the legislation, because there was no criteria within the proposed bill for under 18s at that point. And by early January, the Seanad debates commence to discuss the actual bill. And it has widespread support for change, because most people in the Seanad, and this is all on the record, stand up and speak to, why this legislation wasn't good enough. And the community found many allies there willing to speak on our behalf. People that you would not expect necessarily. People, obvious ones like Catherine Spone, David Norris, Gillian Van Turnout, Naval Power, but individuals that you would not expect, people like Gerard Crockwell and amazingly Fidelma Healy-Eames, all stand up and believe that the bill is not as it should be and should be improved, and the requirement for the medical signatures should not be there. But also that, and in the case of Fidelma Healy-Eames' case, is that young people should be included in the bill, which they are not. The government was still determined to enact the legislation, and they weren't really listening to a lot of people. They weren't listening to the Ombudsman for Children, who suggested also the inclusion of under 18s in the legislation. They wouldn't remove the divorce clause, which required trans people to divorce their spouse in order to get recognition. They did, however, recognize that if marriage equality came in May, that they would possibly have no problem. Then they would be able to remove that clause at that stage, and they wanted to wait until May. And also then there was attempts to open up that bottleneck that I mentioned earlier, of having medics sign off on your legal right to identify as who you choose. And how we did that was we looked at ways of trying to ask, say, for instance, GPs. Everybody has a GP. Therefore, instead of having these specific expert medics, if it's only a signature, why do they need to be an expert medic? Why not go to a GP? Everybody has a GP. And we asked at the time, and slightly sideswiped the government in this in a way, that we asked the Irish College of GPs, would they have a problem with that? They wrote a letter to say, no, they didn't have a problem with that. They felt their members would be okay. All they were doing was witnessing a signature. They weren't vouching for any, part of your identity being trans. And secondly, we then, when the government said, well, we'll need to speak to the ICGP, Irish College of General Practitioners, we said, and we'll also have to speak to the NUI. Oh, sorry, lost me train of thought there for a minute. That we also produce another letter from them saying that was okay. However, coming out of the Shannon debates, all we had got was an agreement for review. And at that point, we were quite disappointed, quite depressed about it all. And one of the things we decided, and this is key, I suppose, sometimes it's always about little things that occur in campaigns. You know, at one point we made a decision to ring every single TD because it was about to move into the Dáil. And on one afternoon, every TD was rang to speak and spoken to. At one point, I think we had somewhere around 86 meetings, whether it was in person or on the phone, with 86 different TDs. There were a number of people traveled around the country over the next 4 or 5 days to try and get to each of them to explain what was going on. And at that point, by the Wednesday, the 5th of March, 27 TDs all across the party stood up in the Dáil and suggested, even government parties suggested that the legislation didn't go far enough and that this was the opportune time to get it right, not to be putting in something that was wrong, but to put something in now that we would be all proud of going forward in the future. And also that, you know, not only to move forward, but to include young people in the legislation, to include people who are non-binary, to include all the various different aspects that were being recommended by the community through the documentation and the literature that Tenny had provided within that period of time. And as we watched in the gallery, you know, every single one of those TDs all quoted from our literature, but also thanked Dr. Foy, you know, for bringing forward this important legal case and therefore making sure that this was something that the state was going to be bringing forward. And every single one of them, those deputies also stood up and clearly had a clear understanding of what was needed. You know, Richard Boyd Barrett summed up the feeling across the House, I think, you know, where he said, we have come a long way, but it is a pity we just can't go the whole way. You know, Deputy Willie O'Dea referred to the fact that the bill is, in a way, a form of Irish solution to an Irish problem. We certainly can't state that it's based on international best practice, but that we were trying to bring in something that wasn't quite all the way there. And what's important to realise is that by that point, there were already 2 pieces of legislation and acts, both in Malta, it was a very similar type of country to Ireland, and Argentina, that had given full self-determination rights to their trans citizens. And that's what we were looking to try and provide. And, you know, in the final speech on that day, Deputy Andrew Doyle stood up and said, it's important that all outstanding issues raised by the community and others are taken on board during the discussion stage, because after so many years waiting for this legislation, after 22 years of Dr. Foy arguing in court, that, you know, we must ensure that it was fit for purpose and that there was no point in legislation that is well-intentioned but is not going to work for some of us. So while the government at that point made the decision to continue the process, they decided to park the debates until after the marriage equality referendum, because they felt that if they removed the marriage divorce clause, they would then be able to move forward again. However, in the meantime, they did invite us in to discuss the benefits of legal recognition based on self-determination, to provide other examples of where it's used, to provide the various different mechanisms that work and how an administrative process would work over that period of time, and which was very much well worth the time, because they then learned about other situations and also learned about the benefit of this. In the meantime, the trans community are still in the press, in the media, in the newspapers, on the TV, in the radio, trying to argue the point of why this legislation was important. But all of these things constantly being moved were little things, you know, and it's sometimes each of those little things that can change that course, you know, or change the course of history for that matter. You know, and that day, for instance, that I mentioned about ringing and talking to every single TD that possible was one of those days. Those parents meeting Minister Burton, you know, the appearances of various different trans people on television programs or radio, or writing opinion pieces, or the involvement of the European Commissioner for Human Rights, the two of them, both Thomas Hammersberg and Niels Muizniek, both their input writing to the government saying that it was a clear need for gender recognition based on self-determination, all had an effect, I think, on where we eventually got to. And on the morning of marriage equality, and I'll share this with you, my own little moment of memory, is that on the morning of marriage equality referendum being counted, I remember being in the RDS doing some tallies on behalf of the National Lesbian and Gay Federation, NXF. And I met Minister Humphreys, who was also tallying for Labour at the time. And I happened to say, you could, the groundswell of the feeling of marriage equality was happening at that point. And I remember saying to him on that morning, you know, Minister Humphreys, if you're ever going to give us what we want, now is the time, because there was such a groundswell of goodwill at that stage. And also we felt that we had made a good case as to why it was important for gender recognition based on self-determination, and that based on such a progressive concept, you know, that trans people should be the arbiters of our own identity, and every individual should be the arbiters of our own identity, so that we should be able to expand out this this goodwill to the trans community as well. And on the Tuesday after marriage equality, Minister Bruton, going into the cabinet meeting, suggested that trans people at this point should be given the opportunity to be recognised for who they are. And so on the 17th of July 2015, the Seanad passed the final act of what is known as the Gender Recognition Act, based on self-determination. And Ireland at that point became the fourth country in the world. By that stage, Denmark had also joined Argentina and Malta. And since then, there are now 17 countries with gender recognition based on self-determination, which means that there is no requirement for a medical intervention or diagnosis of mental disorder. Trans people over the age of 18 are able to self-declare their gender through an administrative process. And on the 8th of September 2015, that act was enacted by Minister Burton. And as you can see from some of the pictures there, Dr. Foy eventually receives her birth certificate. She gets the first gender recognition certificate, number 1, and hence then gets her new birth certificate after 22 years of campaigning. Also, in the same year, she receives the European Citizen of the Year award for all the work that she has done. This is a copy of her birth cert. She loves being able to share it, so she's been giving me permission to share. And what's interesting, I said earlier on, I'm conscious of the time, so Maurice, if I'm going over here, I've only a couple of more minutes left, if I think. What's interesting here is this 22-year legal cases, because Dr. Foy had gone back in 2014 looking for redress, because 7 years after her winning her case in 2007, the government hadn't actually enacted any legislation, despite what Justice McKechnie had said in 2007. But what is interesting is that despite that 22-year campaign, and despite the lobbying and the advocacy and the visibility of the trans community over the previous, probably about 7 or 8 years. Ironically, it's in more recent times, we've realized that actually since 1992, the Passport Office had issued passports with individuals changing their gender on their passport. And in fact, if Dr. Foy in 1992 had realized that, she probably never would have gone down the road she eventually went down, namely a legal case and a series of legal cases. And maybe we might not be in the situation which we are right now with gender recognition based on self-determination, and still one of the most progressive pieces of legislation that's out there. So it's an interesting thing to look at, and maybe somebody better than me could analyze that about, going down that road of taking such a legal case, in hindsight. But so what does the legal case, the Gender Recognition Act, do? It allows individuals to legally change their gender. The act is binary, therefore you can only move from male to female or female to male. The act is accessible to over 18s. There is a mechanism for 16 and 17-year-olds to access the act, but in fairness, you have to have 2 medics, parental consent, and you have to go to the circuit courts in order to get approval. You probably may be better off waiting till 18, which is much quicker. It takes about 2 weeks. There's no access for under 16s or those who identify as non-binary. There are sections which address specific gender and sex crimes, so to ensure that that change of gender doesn't give you protection that you shouldn't have. There is a mechanism for the minister to revoke the certificate. Also, similarly, not for those people who would like to try and hide behind it. It's not possible. And also the Gender Recognition Act allows you to be issued with a new birth certificate. That new birth certificate is issued from the date that you apply from it, and your old birth certificate is locked away for only access, which is only accessible for you or the law. Where to next? I'll be finishing nearly at this. 2018, the Gender Recognition Act review recommended that there should be recognition for under 16s, improvements in access for 16 and 17-year-olds, recognition for non-binary individuals, improvements in the administrative process, and information available across all government departments, because clearly most government departments didn't even know that there was such an act, and also a further review in 2 years. The problem is that we are now in 2022, 4 years later, and none of these recommendations have been implemented. There have been some improvements in the administrative process. However, the government has accepted that they will make the improvements in access for 16 and 17-year-olds, and that's in the programme of government, but nothing else has moved. Part of the reason for that is COVID, but generally it's down to the fact that the government didn't move quick enough in 2018 and 2019. So, thank you. That's my talk for this evening. I hope I've given you a little bit of overview of some of the things that have gone on in the history of gender recognition in Ireland. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So we are coming up to 7. So we don't have much time for questions, but if there are any, please do let me know and we'll try and fit at least one in. Thanks for the detailed talk, Sarah. I was wondering, I guess, to close it out, thanks for kind of pointing the way forward at the end, sort of a natural point to end our evening. But I guess just about changing the legal landscape, but what do you think, how do we change the media landscape, right? Because I think that's quite an important frontier as well. What kind of actions do we need to take?
Yeah, and I think sometimes, we talk about any social change at all. I think a lot of the time we tend to see legal change coming before social change sometimes. And that's difficult because in lots of ways we saw a lot of social change happening as we were arguing for that legal change. But however, we've, as you're probably alluding to, regressed quite a lot in recent times. Attitudes toward trans people are are quite difficult at the moment. There's quite a lot of negativity out there. To a certain, I don't like saying it's all coming from outside. It's not. There is definitely some of it here. But how to change that media? I think the media is influenced these days. It's very different to say the media 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There's a lot of focus on, to a certain degree, clickbait, whatever is easy to write about, whatever is easy that's being said. Social media has quite a large influence on it. And I'm not so sure how, I think, to change that. I think we try to put out as much positive visibility into the media as we can. Trans people, basically, all they want to do is just get on with their lives. These are just legal rights that we're trying to achieve so that we can make our lives easier. The ability to have a document which makes you traverse life in an easy way without causing you embarrassment or causing you problems. That's all we're looking for, is that right, those rights. And also then the rights to services that we require. But generally, if they're in place in both cases, all we want to do is get on with our lives. We're not here to be causing trouble. And it's to try and, we're not trying to remove other people's rights either, if you're saying that you're removing, you're removing somebody else's rights, well, that means you have all the rights then, and that's not, granting me rights doesn't take away from your rights. So therefore, I think there's a education piece across media to understand what they're actually saying sometimes. This understanding that actually, guys, some of this is nonsense. It might look okay and reasonable on the page, but in reality, but I do think there's a big job of work that has to be done on trying to change that, both media-wise and socially, for the community. Generally, most trans people are just getting on with their lives out there. They traverse the small villages and towns of this country and have supportive family and friends and schools and jobs. And, it's about getting that on a national level for media to stop being so sensationalist about us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. Well, I guess on that note of a big job of work to do, we'll close out. So finally then, to thank Sarah again, to thank everyone who spoke today, Vicky, and Paul as well, and also to thank James, who's been behind the scenes managing all the tech throughout the day as well. My big personal thanks to James as well. So that finishes EPIC's contribution to Outing the Past. Please do tune into all the other hubs that are hosting fantastic events, some in person, some hybrid, some online, so you can check all of those out. And that's it from me. Sarah, feel free to log out as normal, and thanks very much. And I'll say goodbye to you all now. Enjoy your respective dinners and your Tuesday evenings. It's just clearing up here in Belfast. So bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.